Development of the IS-4 began as early as 1943 at the ChKZ plant in Chelyabinsk. After the complicated and convoluted development of the first series of prototypes under index Object 701, the project was abandoned. However, in 1946 the project was revived due to issues with the IS-3. Redesigned and equipped with a 122mm D25T gun, the tank would enter production in late 1946. Due to major production and reliability issues, it would not enter service until 1947. Even so, its entire service history was plagued by poor reliability. A midlife upgrade was made in the 1950s, but the tank would still see only limited service, and eventually, in the late 1960s, most met their dishonorable end as stationary bunkers along the Soviet-Chinese border. The IS-4 project can be traced back to summer 1943, when the Chelyabinsk Kirov plant, or ChKZ for short, on its own initiative, began development of an IS-2 successor. The IS-2 had not even entered service by this point, but several shortcomings regarding the IS-1 were well known and would pass on to its descendant, with the main concern being armour protection. In November of the same year, GABTU, the main Directorate of Armoured Forces, aware of these concerns, proposed both a deep modernisation of the IS-2 tank and a new vehicle as the replacement. After the requirements for a new heavy tank were issued, both the LKZ, Leningrad Kirov plant, and ChKZ plants would begin independent development of rivaling projects. The LKZ worked together with Factory No. 100 and developed the IS-6, as well as a series of other drawings and prototypes. On the other hand, ChKZ not only developed an IS-2 upgrade, but also began development of extensive redesigns and completely new heavy tanks, which evolved into the IS-3 and the IS-4. In November 1943, GABTU laid down the requirements for a new heavy tank. It was supposed to have a mass of 55 tons, crew of 5, armour of 160 to 200 mm, an 800 to 1000 horsepower engine, and be armed either with a 122 or with a 152 mm gun. By the 10th of December, the ChKZ would present its project to the People's Commissar of Tank Industry, V.A. Malyashev, who approved it and secured the state funding. This first draft was known as Project K, or K1, and it featured a lengthened hull, thicker armour with a redesigned layout, as well as a new turret. By January, the project evolved and was given a new index, Object 701. While the hull remained mostly unchanged, the turret was altered with a redesigned front and gun mantlet, new turret roof, and the removal of the machine gun port at the rear. The gun of choice was the 122mm S-34-2, and the tank was to be powered by the 750 horsepower V12 engine. On the 8th of April 1944, Stalin gave the go-ahead for the production of Object 701 prototypes. The first prototype, marked number 0, entered production 2 days later and was ready for trials by the end of April of the same year. Production of the next 2 prototypes was approved soon after, and they were given indexes number 1 and number 2. Both were completed between May and June of 1944. Prototype number 1 was simplified for the sake of production, and had some elements removed, such as the turret handles. It featured the 122mm S-34-2 gun and a 50mm S-11 mortar in the turret. Prototype number 2 used a 100mm S-34-1 gun. By the end of July, both prototypes underwent testing and were subsequently dismantled and analysed. The analysis revealed several issues with the transmission and the V12 engine. Fourth, partly stripped down prototype number 3 was produced for ballistic tests, and it underwent trials in August at the Kubinka artillery polygon. After both Soviet and German guns were put up against it, it was noted that the tank had superior protection against incoming fire compared to the IS-2, but was still not completely immune to 75 and 88mm German guns, with the turret being especially vulnerable. On the 11th of August 1944, the People's Commissar of the Tank Industry ordered the ChKZ plant to redesign the Object 701, taking into account trial results, and to produce a new prototype for testing. By the end of September, work commenced on designing the Object 701 No. 4. The main modifications included increasing the thickness of the frontal armour plates from 120mm to 140mm, and the turret armour to 200mm. At the same time, both prototypes number 1 and number 2 were in the process of being refitted with new equipment and components. With these changes, prototype number 1 was renamed to prototype number 5, and prototype number 2 was renamed to prototype number 6. Work on prototype number 4 continued in parallel, and it was built in November, featuring the new armour layout. The 3 prototypes underwent driving trials once again, in the latter half of November. After conclusion of the driving trials by the end of November, prototypes number 5 and 6 were armed with a 122mm S-34 and 122mm D-25T guns respectively, and sent to Kubinka for ballistic trials. Despite several minor defects and a supercharger failure, subsequently causing an engine failure, the tanks were generally praised by the factory and the State Commission. Head of the Testing Commission praised the Object 701 for its protection, armament, manoeuvrability and even reliability, and concluded that the tank was fit for adoption by the Red Army. However, the People's Commissar of Tank Industry, V.A. Malyashev, was against the adoption of the Object 701 into service, stating that the vehicle had not been tested enough and that starting production of a new heavy tank would lead to a decrease in overall tank production. Malyashev believed that the trials were incomplete and not up to the standard, as well as noting that the ChKZ plant was not capable of producing the Object 701, IS-2, ISU self-propelled gun, and the new IS-3 simultaneously. Lastly, he considered the IS-3 to be more fit for production due to its simpler construction and arguably better protection. ChKZ officials and engineers disagreed, which sparked a controversy among Soviet officials, and so a compromise was made in March of 1945. It was agreed that the testing of the Object 701 would be done once again in harsher conditions, while the ChKZ plant was allowed to start preparing for the production of the tank. The new trials for prototype number 6 began in April and ended a few weeks later, after which the Commission concluded that despite the occasional issues, the mechanical components were sufficiently reliable. By the end of July, the Object 701 was once again proposed to enter production, but Malyashev was hell-bent on not accepting the tank into service, claiming that the production of heavy tanks was already experiencing issues. With the war in Europe coming to an end and with factories slowly scaling back their production, the fate of the Object 701 project remained in a constant state of uncertainty throughout 1945. There was also the question of the IS-3, which not only fully occupied the ChKZ's production lines but also made the Object 701 completely redundant in the eyes of many. By early 1946, issues with the IS-3 arose, prompting a proposal to replace its production with Object 701. Despite approval from GABTU in April, the Ministry of Transport Machine Building initially opposed it. Nevertheless, on April 29, 1946, the sixth prototype of Object 701, now named IS-4, was accepted into service with the Red Army. IS-3 production ceased in July, making way for IS-4 mass production in September. Production of the IS-4 thus began at ChKZ, aiming for 155 tanks by year-end, and a production rate of 6 tanks per shift by May 1947. However, with the end of the Second World War, many of the most skilled engineers moved to other sectors, and Soviet plants suffered a brain drain, leading to a substantial decrease in the quality of the delivered tanks. The rest of the year now had to be spent trying to fix these issues, with only 6 IS-4 tanks being built from May to November of 1946, none of which were deemed fit for service. By December, another 1,400 changes were suggested, and nearly 500 new requirements were set by the officials to try to improve the IS-4. In April 1947, 2 IS-4s built in late 1946 entered trials which lasted until June. Many mechanical issues were encountered and several points of improvement were proposed once the trials concluded, most notably that the engine was underpowered, the cooling fans were too loud and the driver visibility was poor when it was buttoned up. Between March and May 1947, ballistic tests were held as well, which proved that the IS-4 was frontally immune to German 128mm shells, with an impact velocity of 800 meters per second. After even more trials and changes made to the design in summer 1947, the IS-4 was essentially a completely new tank compared to what had been accepted into service over a year earlier. The arduous process of trials and redesigns led to a very low number of IS-4 tanks entering service in 1947, just 52 out of the 200 quota, of which only 46 were built that year, the other 6 tanks being from the 1946 pilot batch. In January 1948, the Red Army stopped accepting IS-4 deliveries due to newfound problems with the transmissions. Acceptance resumed a month later after ChKZ officials assured that the issues would be addressed by March. Small improvements to the tank kept being made throughout the production run, such as the TPU-47 intercom being added in March 1948, the road wheel adjustments in May, and an addition of an automated fuel dumping system in August. During spring and summer of 1948, GABTU tested 7 IS-4 tanks. All of them suffered engine, gearbox, transmission failures and many other issues. Other problems noted were the inadequate performance of the radio and poor dust sealing and evacuation of the fighting compartment, decreasing the crew's combat ability. In August, the military once again ceased acceptance of IS-4 tanks due to mechanical problems. This led to a compromise where the military would test up to half of the newly delivered tanks before pressing them into service. During one such test, held in December 1948, 18 out of 24 IS-4 tanks suffered engine or transmission failure. Total IS-4 production was of 224 tanks, although certain sources claim the number was as high as 233. However, this is most likely due to double counts, such as the prototype number 6, which was actually based on the prototype number 2, or the 1946 pilot batch tanks, which were received by the Army in 1947. Adding the extra 25 IS-4Ms, the total was around 250 tanks. Random quality control checks of the IS-4 production line at ChKZ revealed that several components were poorly built, leading the military to yet again stop accepting IS-4 tanks, starting 1st of January 1949. The fate of the IS-4 was now to be decided during the meeting of the Council of Ministers of the USSR in February 1949. During the meeting, it was concluded that the ChKZ was to build the last batch of 12 IS-4s by May, after which they will focus on improving the existing tanks. In September 1949, 10 new IS-4s were trialled by the Red Army, but only half of them managed to pass successfully. In total, 1 engine, 2 transmission, 6 road wheels and 1 torsion bar were damaged and required replacement. When ChKZ began receiving these tanks back from the Army, it was noted that they had already sustained considerable wear. 25 additional IS-4s would be built using existing components, incorporating the military's upgrade request. These were indexed IS-4M, and 217 IS-4s would be converted to this standard throughout the year, with all further production and conversion work on these tanks stopping in December 1951. The hull of the IS-4 maintained the general shape and layout of the IS-2, with the exception of some crucial changes, namely the frontal armour plates, final drive housing, and lengthened hull with a 7th road wheel. The main upper frontal plate was steeply angled and the lower hull sidewalls were flat, while the upper hull sides were slightly angled. The IS-4 suspension and running gear were virtually unchanged from the IS-2 and IS-3, though a new sprocket design was used and the tracks were widened. The IS-4's turret maintained a similar shape as that of the IS-2. It was built by welding together 2 large cast segments. By using heavy rounding and angling, a high effective armour thickness could be achieved. On the side of the turret were 5 handles for the tank riders to hold onto. A large armoured plate, 30mm thick, was bolted above in the roof of the turret, allowing for easy access for removal of the gun. The commander's and loader's hatches were situated on the top of the turret, and behind them was the turret ventilation fan. The IS-4 had a crew of 4, commander, gunner, loader and driver. Compared to the IS-3, the IS-4 had a much more spacious turret and an improved fighting compartment thanks to the addition of a turret bustle where the main gun projectiles could be stowed. Additionally, a rotating turret floor, 30mm thick, would provide ease of operation when standing as well as additional protection against mines and spalling. The IS-4's main armament was the tried and tested 122mm D25T gun, also present on the IS-2 and IS-3. The gun could depress to 3 degrees and elevate to 19 degrees. Due to the 2-part ammunition of the gun, the maximum rate of fire was only 2 to 3 rounds per minute. The rounds of the D25T weighed 25 kilograms for the projectile, plus an additional 15 kilograms for the cartridge, and had a muzzle velocity of 781 meters per second. The tank was equipped with BR-471 armor-piercing rounds and OF-471 high-explosive rounds. Secondary armament consisted of 2 12.7mm Dushka machine guns, 1 mounted coaxially to the right of the gun, and 1 mounted on the roof of the turret in front of the loader's hatch. Perhaps the biggest merit of the IS-4 was its impressive armour. Through the use of heavy sloping of the hull as well as rounded casting, the tank had some of the best protection of any heavy tank of the time. The upper frontal plate was 140mm thick, angled at 61 degrees, while the lower frontal plate was 160mm thick, angled at 40 degrees. Side armour plates were 160mm thick. The frontal and side plates were united via cheek plates, 140mm thick and angled at 55 degrees. The turret was even thicker, consisting of 250mm rounded cast armour at the front, tapering to 200mm at the sides and 170mm at the rear. The roof of the turret was 30mm thick. Early in its development, the Object 701 was to be fitted with the V12 engine developed by ChKZ in February 1943. It could output 750 horsepower at 2,100 RPM, and was fitted with a centrifugal turbocharger from an AM-38 aviation engine. The engine was based on the venerable V2, and using the turbocharger, the motor was able to increase the air pressure for the combustion chamber, leading to higher crankshaft RPM. The IS-4 featured 3 internal fuel tanks with a total fuel capacity of 450 litres, enough for 140 kilometres on roads, with additional external fuel tanks of 360 litres, which could increase the range to 250 kilometres. Upon capturing and studying the German Panther tank, the Soviets quickly began helping themselves to the various systems and technologies used. One of these was the engine cooling and air intake system on the IS-4, which was essentially just a Soviet copy of the Panther's German system. In 1947, the first IS-4s to enter service were given to the Chelyabinsk Tank Technical School and the 30th Tank Training Regiment. The first active service unit to receive the IS-4 was the 5th Guards Mechanized Army. However, due to the low and slow production of the IS-4, only one unit was fully equipped with IS-4s. In late January 1949, this unit took part in a military exercise meant to test the reliability and capabilities of the modernized IS-4, as well as T-54 tanks, and after the exercise was finished, it was noted that the tank had a large number of shortcomings. By 1949, the T-10 was to replace the IS-4, with the 5th Guard Mechanized Army and the IS-4s given to the new heavy tank regiments. However, due to the low number of available IS-4s, nearly 80 were at the plant for repairs. Only 2 regiments were made. In 1954, the tanks were reformed into new heavy tank regiments, along with IS-2 and IS-3 tanks. By 1960, some IS-4s were refurbished, and then all were put into storage. The closest the IS-4 ever got to seeing combat was in the late 1960s, when the relationship between the People's Republic of China and the USSR began to deteriorate, leading to the Chinese creating a 200-kilometre exclusion zone and bringing troops. In return, the Soviets created several fortified sections where various weapon systems and fortifications were made. Here, many obsolete tank types, including a large number of IS-4s, were used as fixed firing points, with some having their turrets removed and installed in complex concrete structures with underground bunkers. Other installations were much more simple, where an IS-4 would simply be dug into the ground. With improving relations, by the 1980s the tank firing points were deactivated, and by 1997 a demilitarization agreement was made between Russia and China. Today some IS-4 wrecks can still be found in Russia, and especially eastern Kazakhstan. Due to the short production run and regretful fate as fixed firing points, most IS-4s have been scrapped, with only 3 survivors being on public display. One, and perhaps the most famous, is the IS-4M at Kubinka, now known as Patriot Park. Another is at the House of Officers of the Chita Garrison, and a third one can be seen at the Semi-Open-Air Military Museum in Kazakhstan. Several other IS-4s are located in various stages of decay in Druzhba village in western Kazakhstan. The IS-4 proved to be a complex and expensive tank that, despite colossal efforts and investments, was never refined and was cursed by reliability problems due to its heavy weight and troublesome engine and transmission. The rough post-war scenario in which it was developed did not help its success either. Despite its thick armour, the D-25T main gun and general layout began to quickly become archaic, and much like the IS-3 it was meant to substitute, it was based on Second World War theory, while the post-war scene was rapidly evolving towards the new main battle tanks and anti-tank missiles. Its short production run and service life make it one of the very few Soviet vehicles to enter service but never see combat. Today it remains overshadowed by the more glamorous IS-3, colossal IS-7, and genuinely capable T-10 in terms of post-war Soviet heavy tanks, the USSR being one of the last nations to give up on the idea of the heavy tank in the 1960s. I've been your host, Paul Charlton, also known as the Mighty Jingles on YouTube. Yes, I also have a YouTube channel which I'm sure the Tanks Encyclopedia will be happy to provide a link to. And if you enjoyed this video, I do encourage you to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. If you'd like to contribute further, consider supporting the Tanks Encyclopedia on Patreon or PayPal to help them continue their work. And as always, keep us in your sights.